Hi, Valentina. How are you?
Hello, I am well, thank you. How are you, Evelina?
I'm very good. So, welcome to those of you who just tuned in. So, welcome to our weekly lives for Research Insights with Elite Mind Academy, where I'm Evelina and my colleague Valentina are sharing insights from well-being industry that often stay behind the closed doors. So, this time we want to highlight a topic that I hope will create some noise because we really want to highlight some concerns about what are specific issues and health concerns that employees are hiding from their employers. Because I think it's so important um, to be able to have some of this awareness, even if employees are hiding something in a way, then what are some of the issues that we need to be overcoming to make sure that we are creating this inclusive, supportive environment. So, yeah, Valentina, anything that you would want to share to kind of kickstart, and if you could just, if you'd like to give a bit of overview of what people who've just tuned in, what can they expect from this talk?
Certainly. So, we've been hearing a lot about different needs that people don't want to share with their employers through our research. And we'll cover some of those in particular, including things like personal grievances, relationship breakdown, things like that, but also anything that involves crime or something illegal. We'll also talk about health conditions that might be undiagnosed and therefore difficult to communicate. And we'll also talk about some of the reasons why somebody might not want to share things with their employers. And we'll start to think about how we might create environments where people feel more able to share those kinds of things with their employers.
But also, we would like to hear from you as well about what do you feel we should be sharing and what we shouldn't, right? Because I think for years we had this culture of working life and personal life has to be separate, right? And we had those boundaries, of leave your monkeys at home, and you don't bring any of your personal issues into workplace. And now there is no longer possible to separate people's lives from their work, especially as most people are working from home. They're working in completely different ways from completely different places, and now before people were kind of like building those boundaries, and to what extent they are useful, and maybe to a certain degree they are serving purpose, and maybe we shouldn't be also pushing for this complete integration of work and life, because that's also maybe helps our work-life balance. So we definitely would love to hear some of your thoughts and questions, and what do you believe should stay as a personal private matters, and what should be brought into workplace. Because when we talk about well-being, personal well-being and workplace well-being are not necessarily the same things, right? There's huge overlap, but they are also two different things. So it would be interesting to explore this overlap as well.
Absolutely. And kind of to kick things off with that, so some of the things that are coming up in our interviews and in our research at the moment is that one thing or something that often people don't want to share with their employers is a health condition or are health conditions that they feel their employer might see as a burden to the company or reduce their productivity, reduce the perception of their ability or capacity to carry out work. And I think this is probably one of the more common things to hide from employers, because there's this perception that we want our employers to think that we're great, to think that we're very good at our jobs, that we're really capable, that we have lots of skills and abilities. We don't want them to think of us as weaker or struggling in any way, because that can then reduce our chances of promotion. It might mean that we don't get put forward for certain projects, and it can also mean that we may end up getting let go or losing our jobs for fear that our health condition might cost us or might cost a company time off.
Yeah. And some of those fears are not really unfounded, right? Because when we look at the statistics, so here are some, for those of you who are looking for data and proof, the research by Benenden Health found that 39% of employees are hiding some sort of health concern from their employers. And when they asked other people, would you actually share some health concerns if you had them, then that figure is 51%. So it's very interesting to see that there is this lack of willingness to open up and to share some of our health concerns for exactly the same reasons that you said. But then from those people who have disclosed their issues, and there are different statistics that show different figures. So the figure is between 9 and 15%. So between 9 and 15% of people who disclosed some of their health issues, they said they have experienced direct discrimination or harassment, or sometimes demotion or even loss of job as a result of their employers knowing about their health conditions. So this is really quite alarming stat. But also when we put it in a context of that working environment, we can kind of understand why is this happening, because some of those concerns are not purposeful, right? So for example, if I am Valentina's employer and Valentina will come to me with all of her stress and something really difficult that she's experiencing in her life, and she's really going through a difficult time, if I have a promotion coming up, I will spare Valentina for that, because I will think like she's going through so much. I would not dare to put more on her shoulders, right? But maybe that promotion would be exactly what is needed for her to carry her through and help her to pull herself together and really have some motivation and drive to go through and get out of that dark patch that she's experiencing in her life, right? So I think there is also this kind of distorted assumption that we want to do best for people, but we don't ask and we don't know what is best for them, and what is best for me might not be best for you, right? So the fact that we are not creating those open conversations when we would really understand how to support that person regardless of what labels and conditions they have, right? And really have those human heart-to-heart conversations and really look at how we can facilitate this support for that person. It's still very much missing from our workplaces.
Certainly. I think that highlights as well a kind of lack of communication and lack of effective communication in terms of understanding the needs of employees. So an employee might share something that they're going through in their personal life, but unless with the health or anything else, but unless there's a constructive and empathetic conversation about, okay, and how can we support you? What does that look like? What is useful? What makes it better? What makes it worse? What's not useful? Those kinds of conversations are really important. It's not just about flagging something and then assuming what needs that person might have or kind of what their situation is and how they might respond to different things.
Yeah.
It's also useful to bear in mind something that has kind of also come up within our research as well, is in kind of somewhat in relation to those lines of open communication. And that is about sometimes people hide if there's harassment or abuse or discrimination at work that is affecting their well-being and their state of mind. If there aren't open channels of communication whereby complaints or reports of abuse or discrimination will be heard, responded to, and kind of the person
dealt with in a way, addressed in whatever way that both parties are happy, right?
Yeah, then a lot of the time those things go unreported, and we are seeing over and over that bad relationships, difficult relationships in the workplace can be a real detractor on our state of well-being. And even to the extent of where somebody is outright kind of abusive and engaging in abusive behavior with other staff members, it can be extremely disempowering to know that there is no avenue for recourse, that there is no support infrastructure there. And also that if you raise a concern potentially about a senior member of staff, acting in an abusive or discriminatory way, that you might end up being the person that suffers for that, loses their job, doesn't get put forward for promotion, etc.
Yeah, definitely, and especially when some of those behaviors are being demonstrated by top leadership, by senior leaders in an organization, that really sets the tone and the culture for the organization and how safe people feel in their environment. So hello once again, and thank you to those who are just joining us now. So Abigail is commenting that open door policy is very much missing from most organizations, which is a cause for concern. And Rob is also adding, saying that constructive listening without judgment conversation is often what never happens. So absolutely. And I think what we are seeing, when we ask to whom you would like to speak about some of your, health concerns, some of the personal, matters, the first response is no one. Very often it's no one, right? It's like, I don't, there are specific things I don't want anyone to know. And then they would share, with their close relatives, with their family members, with their partners. And managers are usually somewhere down the bottom list. Like, this is like the last person that I would speak to. And it's really interesting to hear that when we look at the communication flow and reporting lines that are being set up in organizations, most of the time, your work policy will say that if you have any concern and if you need to get any support, the first person you go to is your line manager. And that in itself is a huge barrier, because now that means that person has no any other way of getting confidential support, and in a way that, without their direct line manager knowing. And when we ask whether that support, when you're expecting that support, do you still expect this from workplace or do you expect it from elsewhere? Person is much more likely to use workspace support for as long as it's guaranteed that it is confidential and they don't have to go through their line manager, right? So very often the way we are referring people and who is our first point of contact that we are sending people and directing to ask for that help is usually barrier in itself, right? So if there is anything else that you take out of this conversation, other than anything else, is creating those safe, confidential spaces for people to go to ask for support through workplace, but in a way that stays confidential from the workplace.
Absolutely. And I think I just kind of, before I move on and comment on that, I'd just like to pick up on, Abigail, your comment that there's a fine line between being listened to and heard. And I think that really comes into these kind of non-listening without judgment conversations, but also into training sometimes. So you mentioned that, what's being spoken, what isn't being spoken. Sometimes it's not just about what's being communicated by someone, actively in their language, but we also have to read what's being communicated from someone in their behavior, withdrawal, body language, things like that, and then ask the right questions can be a really useful way to start those conversations. And just to respond as well to kind of the point about confidentiality, I think something really interesting that has been brought up as well in discussion around confidentiality is, and kind of associated with it, is that some people might face a barrier to sharing things that affect their well-being with their employer if they relate to something illegal. So often, people might be experiencing issues with drugs or gambling or other illegal activity that might be detracting from their well-being, but as a symptom of poor well-being or poor mental health. But the fears around potentially legal recourse or simply a kind of negative view of them professionally would really act as quite a strong barrier. Lots of the time, if there's anything that involves anything illegal, regardless of whether it's to do with your well-being or not, that won't get shared with an employer. Whereas, if there's a confidential space for you to receive support, that could end up helping you with this issue that's in your personal life, but also improving your experience of work.
Yeah, and it's very interesting in terms of criminal activity, when we kind of, in most companies, we have to declare this as part of our recruitment process, right? And then again, if something is happening while we're already employed, what is the right course of action, right? And looking at the barriers between personal life and support that they might need for coping, dealing with that issue. And most of the time, if somebody and I had to address some concerns and work with some situations where people have been fired because they had gambling issues, for example, which is again instead of looking at some of those, I think, Valentina, you rightly mentioned, at looking first at what are those unmet needs of the individuals, right? Because some of this, either criminal activity or some addictions or some other like even like gambling and so on, it results from some unmet needs of that individual. So that's the help, that's the only way how person will go and meet some of those needs at kind of deep psychological level. And if they don't have any alternative, if they don't have a healthy outlet to go and meet some of those evolutionary needs in a way as human beings, right? Like we all have all of those needs for safety, for inclusion, for belonging, also for excitement and some level of risks, but also for inclusion and belonging. And how do we go about meeting those needs can really go to extremes. And again, we learn some of those coping mechanisms through our childhood, through our environment, through our social connections and other people that we surround ourselves with. And instead of actually looking at the problem and blaming the person for kind of behaving in that specific way, or sometimes again, like for mental health illnesses, right? How often people are being victimized for this, as if you're not being positive enough, you're not being strong enough, you're not being, whatever, good enough in whatever shape and form, right? But instead, if we're looking at all of those things as symptoms of our deep unmet needs, then we can be much more empathetic about that journey and look at, okay, if we support this person in a right way, then there is no need for them to then engage in some of those other activities. And they don't know how themselves, that's the best that they can do, right? So it's really, really important to kind of sometimes see beyond that behavior and see beyond that and really look at the context and the situation and the reasons behind that person's behavior, right? Like, why exactly are they doing this? What are these unmet needs? And what are some of those sometimes, living conditions and the reality of that individual that they are experiencing that results in them having this action as the only reasonable course of action for them to be okay, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really useful reference as well to potentially undiagnosed conditions. When sometimes our behavior and the events and actions in our lives, be it criminal or not criminal, are indications for undiagnosed conditions. And lots of people would rather not have a diagnosis. That's fair enough. We don't always want to be attributed to a label or a particular kind of group, but it can make it, these things can point to, just like you say, unmet needs. So if we're looking at behaviors like impulsivity or reduced inhibitions, that can point to certain neurological conditions, and things like betting, gambling, or crimes around finances can point to difficulty managing finances, or low financial well-being. Could also allow an employer to be aware of potentially some of the other stresses and strains on somebody's life. They might be caring for older family members, and that could be a financial drain. And then therefore there might be actually some support that's useful that for that particular situation that might be otherwise unknown. So I think that can be really useful as well to, when we're looking at behaviors or kind of actions that people might want to hide from their employers. What, like you say, are the unmet needs that those are actually pointing to? And if we can learn to support those needs and have constructive, open, and non-judgmental conversations about them, then we're more likely to be able to address them properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And Abigail mentioned here saying that in healthcare, we have a lot of nurses who are afraid to whistleblow because they don't feel psychologically safe. And absolutely, if we don't have that safe environment, you will be afraid to raise any concerns because it will be, taken against you in most cases. But also, I think, from HR perspective, I think when we think from HR and even some of this language that you are using, like whistleblowing, right? It's such a negative language, right? In a way, as if you are, you highlighting some of these, red fire spots in the business, and now we have to, quiet you down, as soon as possible before this does any damage to the business, And this approach is completely wrong, because if you think about the history of the HR function, originally HR is not there to protect people. HR function was there to protect business from the people, right? So obviously it has to go that way. Like, how do I navigate this boundary that, we don't do harm to people and people then in turn don't harm our company's name and reputation and the business, right? And now, of course, we have the whole history of all of the logistics and all of these kind of strategic setup where HR sits. Now, HR is not most of the time even strategic department in many ways, right? It kind of sits somewhere outside. There's so rarely that HR is included at the strategic decision making. There are a handful of organizations that would only have, let's say, a head of HR at the board level, right? That's so rare, because we are really seeing this as something that kind of sits outside and just like protects the business and kind of manages those relationships as if it has nothing to do with our overall business strategy, and again, as if it has no way of doing the right thing for people, right? So yeah.
Sorry. Well, I was going to say about how important as well it is to focus on, and this is something that's been coming up in our research, is that what goes on in HR, the policies, the procedures, are only so good as they filter into culture. It doesn't matter if there's a really strong complaints policy, but if that doesn't filter into an open culture in which people are encouraged to share critique, then it means nothing. Similarly, if there could be a really extensive and exhaustive ED&I policy, but if that doesn't translate into culture, into creating that psychological safety for seldom heard groups, then it doesn't matter. So just like you say, HR, this function of looking after people and the relationships between people, employees and employers, that is not something that can sit and work in a silo. That has to be fed into
part of the broader business strategy and part of the culture. And it really the way we place the entire kind of people's function in strategically, how do we position it, what are these conversational links and the channels of the data flow? It's so crucial. And in terms of all of this variety of concerns that are being kind of hidden from employers, all throughout kind of the history of your work, we actually see different things are being kind of hidden at different ages as well, which is very, very interesting. So Sarah commented, for example, that menopause is very relevant to this conversation and often leads to discrimination. So absolutely. And I think, what also is very important, that, even as a society, like, we are not aware of what menopause experience really is, right? Other than hot flushes, right? It's like we don't really understand in general, like even GPs are not given that training, right? Because it's a specific to women's health, and 43% of women who start experiencing perimenopausal symptoms are being prescribed antidepressants, right? So even if GPs, if some of those people who are supposed to be doing the right thing are not even aware of those symptoms, then how can we be, right? So of course, this conversation, starts from our healthcare, from our awareness, from our education. But then when we're bringing it in our workplaces, what does that mean for our workplace? And now this actually includes much broader context of hormonal health. So this is not just about menopause, but actually we all experience variety of hormonal issues all throughout, right? And it could be cycle related for women, it could be fertility related, it could be gender change related, right? When we are going through treatments to let's say to transition, right? All of those things should fall under the umbrella of hormonal health, right? And those are this variety of those needs. Again, if somebody is going for through fertility difficulties, and now so many couples are struggling to conceive, for example, and this becomes a huge part of stress and pressure. And also if someone is going through IVF treatment, for example, the pressure, the stress that you are causing physically on your body to go through this, it's horrendous. And of course it's going to affect your work performance, and of course it's going to affect your cognitive performance, and of course it will affect how you feel about yourself and others, and so on. So if we are hiding some of those key parts of what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to experience life, right, in terms of relationships and motherhood and fertility and menopause and all of those things that is part of being human and who we are, if we are hiding those key crucial elements of that, if we don't include them in the workplace, then what chances are there that we're going to be talking about some chronic illnesses and some other mental illnesses that are hugely discriminated, such as like schizophrenia, for example, right? It's no one will ever declare that because of the such negative connotations that we have as a society to this. So I think definitely it's all very well kind of talking and having those conversations, but unless it's really included in the workplace a culture, in the way we live, in the way we support human needs, regardless at what stage of their life experience they are, I think it's really good start of kind of starting with those things that we are all experiencing, right? We are all aging, we are all having, some other life difficulties that are simply human. And if we start to have very inclusive conversation about that, then it creates that safety of I am valued as a human being and my experiences matters. And the way I go through life and through challenges, I don't have to do this on my own, right? Like workplace is there for me and with me to go on that journey and support me through all of this. And if we do that, then I think we open up much wider kind of a open conversation channel where now people feel valued just who they are, for their identity, for their diversity, for being included as human beings and being valued for that now they will feel much more comfortable to then highlight some other concerns and issues that at the moment are not being talked about.
Certainly. And I think that kind of creating that culture as well can help overcome this barrier that people have generally, like you mentioned, about separating our work and our personal lives. And often people think, well, I just wouldn't talk to work about that. It's not appropriate for work. I don't have those relationships with people at work. Therefore, I keep my work and my personal life separate. And I can understand there's also a benefit in that to a certain extent, in that it enables us to have an escape. We can have some mental boundaries in terms of our emotional regulation. But there are some things that will affect your experience of work, and it would be nice to feel kind of psychologically safe enough to be able to share those emotions and be able to share those experiences. Lots of people don't feel comfortable sharing things that are happening in their relationships, in their romantic relationships and family relationships, and anything as well that can be associated with shame or taboo. Sometimes sexual crime, sexual assault or abuse often doesn't get heard in the workplace or talked about in the workplace because of those cultural taboos. And also I think it's worth noting that within and amongst different cultures, there will be different things that will be seen as and understood as more or less acceptable to bring up in a workplace. And there needs to be an awareness of that around kind of creating psychologically safe environments where people feel like they can talk about these things, but also exactly like you say, Evelina, that there's a confidential route to do so. Because sometimes it might feel, we might feel open and comfortable talking to our colleagues if we have those relationships and kind of a history of feeling unashamed of those things. But actually, for a lot of individuals, they might want to receive support or simply be able to talk about something, but it is kind of, it needs to be confidential to protect against this barrier of shame and taboo.
Yeah, and then it's very interesting to explore how this needs to happen. How can we establish some of those boundaries, right? And some of the best examples that we've seen, there is something that Rob has shared, is kind of peer support and accountability circles, where you include, as part of your ways of working, you include a way of having support groups where you just come in and you share, what you're feeling, what you are experiencing, and it's something that it's part of your job. You must attend. It's not just like it's there if you need it, but it's a space that it's part of your job description. You go there, and let's say, I don't know, once a week, once a month, in whatever way that you have to be there. You don't have to speak, and you don't have to share anything, and that's the key, right? But just having this habit of holding that space for someone. And there are some of those groups where people come in and just sit in silence for 20 minutes, right? And sometimes it's just like half an hour every week, but it's a space where every department, or in whatever way those groups are kind of structured, that people just come together and they can share what's on their mind, what's on their, what they're feeling, what they're struggling with, and other people just kind of hold that space for them, right? And you set very clear rules that there is confidentiality, that nothing leaves the room. And it's a really nice way of doing this, because even if somebody's been sat there for weeks and months and haven't said a word, they build that trust with that group, and therefore they are much more likely to even speak to that person outside of that group when they need that support, because they have experienced what does it mean to actually to be heard, to be held in that kind of emotional struggle, right? So that can be a very nice way of doing this, and it works very well when it is facilitated by an expert. So it's not just it is a peer-to-peer group, but it's good to have an expert, either therapist, psychologist, or someone with a coaching experience, who can really hold the space and maybe ask people the right questions and kind of help to create that safety and environment of trust. So yeah, it can work very well, but of course there's a lot of challenges in making that right in reality, because again, we need to make sure that nothing out of that room kind of affects someone else's experience at work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of a big part of that as well, you say something that's facilitated by an expert, and also something facilitated by an external expert.
Yes, that's
so
right.
that's having that feeling like a space that is outside of work, that is outside of your normal hierarchies and dynamics, that essentially nothing is going to be passed back. Like you say, there's there has to be this trust and this confidentiality established within the group. But I think that those kinds of conversations and those kinds of like accountability circles or talking groups can be really, really useful for just starting to bring a little bit more of an open communicative culture into the workplace, and painting it as a psychologically safe environment. We talk about how to create psychologically safe environments, and most of the time this comes down to empathy and building empathy in our employees. And these kinds of initiatives can be really useful in helping people connect and helping people see the commonalities, the things that join us and connect us, rather than identifying with the things that might disconnect us or noticing difference.
Absolutely. And finding experiences that can bond people rather than create boundaries. And very often, some of these ways that create conversations and openness and trust is going out and having alcohol, right? And this is the most common approach that so many organizations still use. Like, there you go, your Friday night drinks, off you go and just offload and speak to your colleagues and so on. And while maybe the outcome is beneficial to a degree for some people, and it helps to build that trust and connection and help to open up maybe in some ways, it also excludes some people who otherwise would not want to drink, but they feel that they will be excluded. And there were also some cases from with people that and businesses that we've spoken with, where there were people who do not drink alcohol for religious reasons, and they didn't even feel like they can say this, and therefore they went out drinking with their colleagues every week, and they had this huge internal conflict of doing the wrong thing due for their faith and for their belief systems. And yet they knew that if they raised those concerns, it would not be, they would be excluded from this, social group and this way of connecting with others. So what are the right ways of doing this? What are some alternative activities that do not exclude and discriminate? And what are other healthy ways of building those connections and openness, but also maintaining this confidentiality? Talking about boundaries as well, there is this again, Valentina, you mentioned different cultures experiencing what is okay to share and what is not okay to share in different contexts, and Japan, for example, is quite extreme in terms of separating a personal life from work, but they have this drinking culture where you still go out and you drink with your colleagues, and you can say and do anything, but next day no one is ever allowed to mention it. No one's allowed to bring it into the workplace. But in kind of Western cultures, we open this Pandora's box of, oh, did you see, what that person did when they were too drunk to think for themselves? So, and it creates this gossip, and, people bring back, this back to the office, and it excludes people who were not part of that. And there is huge, huge kind of damaging behaviors that are being created as a result of this. And yeah, so we definitely, like, we agreed that in our company we would never pay, for example, for alcohol by the company, because if we're promoting well-being, if we're promoting health, this is just the wrong way to go, right? So question for everyone here is, how can we replace this trust building exercise through alcohol with healthy means? What are the activities that you'd like to see that would actually build that trust and would facilitate some of those conversations where people feel okay to share their struggles, their health issues, and their life experiences with others?
Absolutely. I think something that's kind of worth noting there as well is that role modeling from senior leadership can be such a useful way to kind of ignite that culture of openness, whereby you don't necessarily need alcohol. Often we have this picture of senior leadership as, all business and quite separate, and, you don't really engage with their personal life so much. But, having role models within kind of at the top of an organization who are sharing what they're going through things in their family, health conditions, stress, anything like that I think is really, really useful to start practicing. We can tell people to be open, but the best way actually to make somebody feel comfortable being vulnerable is to be vulnerable ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. And here is a very important point here, that now we have this culture of, let's talk about mental health, right? And what is the most common thing that we see businesses are doing? They are bringing an influencer or a person with lived experience, an ambassador for mental health. They're bringing them in, they put them on the stage, and they ask them to share their experiences. And this is very, I kind of have very mixed opinions about this, because it's okay to talk about mental health, and we definitely need to have a place for those conversations. And I have a lot of admiration for people who gone through their life experiences, and now they use them for good, and they really take this into the charitable work, into their work to kind of create more inclusive world, and provide those conversations and support that they didn't have. However, before we tell people to open up and talk, we need to first create safety for people to even know that they will not be affected by hearing this personally, right? So sometimes the number of times that people have been re-triggered by something for their personal experiences by no filters mental health talk, The number of times where people with lived experiences have been invited to share their experiences in podcasts, and by person who has no experience of trauma and mental health is pulling things out of that person, and they end up sharing more than they wanted to, and it really creates a lot of damage and trauma around this in terms of how do we really position this, right? And again, if we are just opening this box and we're talking about it, but we don't have anything practical to support people, if we don't have this safe, confidential space for people to go to and open up to those conversations, if we don't have, a culture of safety and trust and non-discrimination, then opening that conversation will actually create some risks, because you are highlighting some concerns and you might be triggering certain things, and now you leave people empty-handed with nowhere to go. And if, like you mentioned, if top leadership are not prepared to be part of that conversation, then no influencer talk will ever save you, because now you are seeing us as something out there, right? For people out here, it's okay to talk. And yet we have very different cultures. So if you want to start those conversations, it shouldn't be by an external person sharing their experience. It's supposed to be by people internally in leadership team start to show their vulnerability and their experiences and their struggles, to show that, regardless of what role I'm in, I'm still just a human being. And that's the best thing that we can do to create that safety and safe environment, other than just telling people to talk, telling people to open up and telling them to ask for help is not good enough. We need to role model this from top leadership. And we also, instead of telling people to reach out, we need to be reaching in, and we need to be training our leaders, our managers, to know how to notice some of those things and how to provide support in a way that maybe that person doesn't even know themselves that they need.
Absolutely. You've highlighted something really key there, in that sometimes people hide things from their employers because they don't have the language or the understanding themselves to know what they're experiencing to express it. So I think that's a really useful point. And kind of, if anyone who wants to hear more about that, hear more about what managers can do to reach in and support, then do catch the recording from last week where we're talking about the people skills that line managers in general need to have.
Wonderful. And next week, based on some of the questions and messages that we've been receiving, I think we're going to cover a topic of surveys and surveying your employees, right? Because I think when we talk about, what we don't know about our employees and what we should know and so on, we use surveys as a, you put it out there, employee engagement surveys, annual evaluations, and, different other surveys throughout. But actually, is this the right way of doing this? Is there a better way of really finding out how your employees feel? So we'll be looking at engagement surveys and other tools that are available there for you to kind of assess employee needs next time. And for now, as well, if you would like any other help and support with building your healthier culture, establishing better skills for managers to be able to handle those uncomfortable conversations, if you would like any support in assessing your employee needs and creating that safety of trust, please do reach out to us. We still have a couple of places, fully funded research places left for our Wellbeing Design project. So if you would like any help and support, reach out to us and we can see what we can do for you.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your engagement, and I look forward to speaking to you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good week.